and welcome to Welcome Road Baptist Church and the Fundamentals of Christianity. Thank you for joining us today. This is the third lesson in our series on the wilderness and walking through and in the wilderness. Here we've been studying Psalm 63. And we've been looking at some principles that David has laid out for us and that God is revealing through David's life as David goes through this journey. We've been studying the wilderness. We've looked at what the wilderness is. It's a place of desertion. It's a place of desperation. It's a place of isolation. It's a place that is barren and dry. And all of those concepts of the wilderness in the Bible can represent different things in different times in our lives, whether it be depression, desertion, dryness. It could even be death, the loss of a loved one, or the loss of a job. All of those situations and circumstances, spiritual battles, can represent times that we're in the wilderness. Now, we've mentioned this, that there are two reasons why we may find ourselves in the wilderness. The first reason is because of the temptation of sin. We are tempted with sin, and we sin against God. That is why David is in this wilderness. Absalom, his son, is pursuing him. God told David that because of his sin with Bathsheba, the sword would never depart out of his house. Through several circumstances, David finds himself in this situation. But there's also times that we're in the wilderness due to times of suffering or testing. Look at the life of Jesus Christ. Christ was in a wilderness. We know he didn't sin, but he was being proven and tested by God. Here in this lesson, I would like to look at the why of the wilderness. Why are we here? What is God desiring to teach us through the times that we're in the wilderness? The first thing I would like for you to consider is a reliance on God's power and His presence. God desires for you and me as His children that while we're in that wilderness, while we're in this circumstance and situation, that we would begin to rely on the power and presence of God. In the two verses that we have here in Psalm 63, 1 and 2, verse number 2, David says that he desires to see the power and the glory of God. Now, the glory of God in the Old Testament speaks of God's presence. And so what we have here with David is that David desires to see the power and presence of God. But why is that? Why does he desire to see it? It is because of the situation that he is in. The situation that he is in, God has used it to cause David to rely on his presence and on his power. God desires to reveal himself to us in these circumstances and situations. So when you're in the wilderness, why am I here? So that you can rely on the power and the presence of God. Secondly, God desires to refocus His priorities. Psalm 63 and verse 3. David says, because thy loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise thee. Now don't read that too fast. Because thy loving kindness is better than life. David said, Lord, your kindness to me, your loving kindness to me is better than life itself. What is David saying here? David says, I would rather have the comforter instead of the comforter, instead of comfort. I would rather have the blesser instead of the blessing. I would rather have the righteousness of God than riches in this life. So what David is saying is through this wilderness, his priorities were reshaped and refocused. God desires to do that in our lives. He desires to do that in your life. Do whatever it is you're going through to reshape your priorities where God is more precious than life itself. Thirdly, I would like for you to consider this. God desires for us to remember His purpose. Now, Psalm 63, verses 4 through 6. We've looked at these verses, but very interesting. Thus will I bless thee while I live. I will lift up my hands in thy name. My soul shall be satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and my mouth shall praise thee with joyful lips, when I remember thee upon my bed and meditate on thee in the night watches. Now, what is David doing? David is remembering God. He is pausing. He is meditating. He is thinking about God. And as he is doing that, what is happening? His mind is being transformed to think about the purpose that God has for his life. He is remembering what God is working. He is remembering what God is doing. Remember, God has a purpose for you. He did not create us and then leave us alone. No, God has created us. He saved us because he has a purpose for our lives. Fourthly, the why, or the fourth why, is God wants us to run to him for protection. Running to God's protection. Psalm 63, 7 and 8. Because thou hast been my help, therefore in the shadow of thy wings will I rejoice. My soul followeth hard after thee. Thy right hand upholdeth me. Well, what is God doing in these wilderness times? He is wanting us to run to him for protection. For example, when we're in these times of wilderness journeys and troubles and dryness and desperation and depression, many times we become angry, we become bitter, we begin to doubt. Our minds are full of unbelief and even unthankfulness. Whatever the sin, whatever the battle, whatever the frustration may be that you're facing, run to God for the protection. Now, God wants us to rely on his glory, his power, and his presence, okay? God wants us to remember his purposes. And God is bringing about these wonderful changes. But what does God desire for us to do? When we have these things that we cannot handle, anger, doubt, unbelief, run to him and allow God to deliver you in that situation. Now, God did not take David out of the wilderness. He's still here. And God will leave you in the wilderness until God is finished with that purpose while you are there. But while you're in the wilderness, run to God for grace. Run to God for strength. Run to God for help and mercy. And God will give those things to you. The purpose is not to take you out of it. No. The purpose is to for God to reveal himself to you while you are there. Don't try to change the circumstance. Don't try to change the situation. There are things that we can do. If someone loses a job, well, you begin to look for another job. Of course. Someone loses a family member. You find ways to fill those voids and of remembrance and thinking about the loved one that passed away. But we all know that the emptiness and the hole will not be filled. And it can only be filled by God. And so what does God want me to do? While I'm in that wilderness, run to him for protection. Run to God for that help. And then lastly, we are to rest in God's providence. Now, these verses are dealing with God defeating the enemies of David, literally defeating them. Now, we can't, as much as we might like to pray for God to defeat our enemies, okay, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, the New Testament tells us and teaches us that. Our enemy is the flesh, Satan in this world. But in the passage, what we see is that David knows that God foresees and foreknows what's going to happen, and that God is working and God is moving. And David knows that God will bring victory. Even while he is in the wilderness, God will bring victory. And the point is that David is resting in the providence of God. Yesterday, I didn't know what was going to happen today. And today, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or the day after. And so what must I do? I must learn to rest in God's providence. I must learn to rest in knowing that God knows what's going to happen tomorrow. And that what does come my way tomorrow is a part of that plan of God as he is leading me and guiding me in my life. God may have purposefully brought those things. He's the author of it. Or he may simply allow it to come. But remember that God is active and we must rest in the activity of God's providence. Thank you for joining me today. My prayer and my desire is that the Lord will bless you. The Lord will help you in all that you do as you continue to walk with Him. May the Lord bless you today, is my prayer.